These projects all came through the same retired firefighter.
Expeditors contact the Bureau every day. That doesn't prove a bribe.
To his colleagues, Anthony Saccavino was a decorated FDNY chief, trusted with the office that keeps New York's buildings from burning. To federal prosecutors, he was a mastermind, selling that trust to the highest bidder. And this footage is where it all caught up with him.
More than 30 of his customers jumped the line.
You're reducing operational decisions to a spreadsheet.
He would not get the chance to explain himself in the moment captured on that footage. Federal agents had been working the case for 14 months. They had the wire transfers. They had the cooperating witness. They had the expediting list itself, project by project, customer by customer, a paper trail spanning 2 years and 30-plus buildings across the 5 boroughs. Anthony Saccavino was a chief in the FDNY's Bureau of Fire Prevention, the office responsible for deciding when a building was safe enough to open its doors to the public. Prosecutors would call him the mastermind. $190,000 in bribes, $57,000 of it in his own pocket, 3 years in a federal prison. Quick question before we get into this one. How much do you trust the inspectors who sign off on the buildings you walk into every day, the office where you work, the apartment where you sleep, the school where you drop off your kids? Drop your honest answer in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now. We cover accountability cases like this every single week, and this one gets worse the deeper you go. Anthony Saccavino was born in 1963 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, the second of 3 sons in a family that traced its way back to a small town outside Naples. His father drove a city bus for the New York City Transit Authority and worked a second shift on weekends doing maintenance at a Catholic school on 18th Avenue. His mother kept the books for a deli her brother owned on 86th Street. The Saccavinos lived in a narrow brick row house with a stoop and a tomato garden in a yard barely wider than a doorway. There were uncles in the building trades. There were cousins on the job at NYPD. And there was a great uncle who had served in the FDNY in the years after the war and whose dress coat hung in a hall closet long after he had been buried out at St. John's. By the time Anthony was 12, he had already decided what he wanted to do with his life. He spent summer afternoons standing on the corner of 86th and Bay Parkway, watching Engine 282 roll out. He memorized the apparatus numbers, the radio chatter from the open bay door, the way the firefighters carried themselves on a quiet day. His mother used to say he was the only kid in Brooklyn who knew the difference between a hose tender and a tower ladder by the age of 10. He graduated from New Utrecht High School in 1981. His evaluations from senior year described him as respectful, quietly determined, with a strong sense of responsibility for younger students. He took the civil service exam for FDNY the first month he was eligible. He scored in the top 3%. He waited 18 months for a class assignment, working construction with a cousin in the interim, framing apartments in a building that would one day, decades later, sit inside the territory of the bureau he would come to lead. He entered the FDNY Probationary Firefighter School on Randall's Island in the spring of 1984. He was 20 years old. His starting salary was just under $23,000. The instructors logged him as physically capable, mentally focused, comes from a city family with strong values. On graduation day, his father pinned the badge to his coat in a hall packed with 500 other proud parents. His great-uncle's dress coat, retrieved from that hall closet in Bensonhurst, was draped over a folding chair in the front row. His first assignment was Engine 245 in Bath Beach. The senior men called him Sack before he had finished unpacking his locker. He lived above his parents' garage for the first 3 years on the job, saving every dollar he could. He worked the busy years of the late 1980s and the early 1990s, the era of the crack epidemic and the worst run of arson cases in the city's modern history. He pulled a man out of a basement fire on Avenue U in 1988 and received his first commendation. He pulled a woman and her 2 children out of a 4th-floor walk-up in Sheepshead Bay in 1991 and received his second. He met his wife, Marisol, at a barbecue thrown by a cousin in Marine Park in the summer of 1989. She was a paralegal at a personal injury firm in downtown Brooklyn, They were married in 1992 at St. Athanasius on Bay Parkway, with half the company of Engine 245 in the pews. They bought their first home, a narrow attached house on Staten Island's North Shore, in 1995. Their first daughter was born the next year. Their son followed in 1999. He made lieutenant in 1996 after passing the promotional exam on the first attempt. He made captain in 2002. By that time, he had been one of the firefighters running into Lower Manhattan on the morning of September 11th, 2001, a fact he would not speak about with civilians for the rest of his career, including his own children. He buried friends. He attended 37 funerals in 8 months. He worked the pile in shifts that began before sunrise and ended in the dark. The promotion to captain came less than a year after the towers fell, in a department that was still counting its losses. He made battalion chief in 2009. He made deputy chief in 2014. By 2017, he held the rank of chief in the Bureau of Fire Prevention. His annual salary by 2021 was $263,000. His performance reviews used the same language year after year. Operationally sound, trusted by subordinates, demonstrates integrity in administrative matters. The last phrase appeared in his 2022 review, signed by a deputy commissioner who had known him since the Bath Beach days. The Bureau of Fire Prevention is the part of the FDNY that most New Yorkers never see and never think about. It does not respond to alarms. It does not roll trucks. Its work happens in offices at Metrotech in downtown Brooklyn and at field stations across the 5 boroughs, and its product is paperwork. Plans approved, inspections scheduled, permits issued, buildings cleared, conditionally cleared, or rejected. The Bureau exists for one reason: before a building can open its doors to the public, before a restaurant can serve a customer, before a school can admit a student, before an office tower can take an elevator load, the fire safety systems inside that building must be vetted by the City of New York. The work is supposed to be done in the order it is received. A developer files for inspection. The request goes on to a list. The list is worked through in sequence. When the developer's number comes up, an inspector is dispatched, and a clipboard becomes the difference between a certificate of occupancy and a project sitting empty while interest payments accumulate. Every day a project waits on inspection is a day the developer pays carrying costs on a building that cannot yet generate revenue. Every day matters. Every day costs money. In the spring of 2020, the city stopped. The Bureau did not. Inspections continued where they could be performed safely. Plans continued to come in. But field work slowed to a fraction of its normal pace as inspectors were pulled to other duties, as buildings sat half-occupied, as construction sites stood still for weeks at a time. By the time the city began to reopen in the fall of 2020 and the spring of 2021, the Bureau was sitting on a backlog of inspections that had grown longer than anyone in Metrotech could remember. Developers who had filed in January of 2020 were still waiting in June of 2021. Owners of buildings that had been finished for months were still waiting for the inspection that would allow them to bring tenants in. The backlog was a fact of the pandemic. It was no one's fault, and it could not be solved by working faster, because the Bureau did not have the personnel to work faster. The list was the list. Everyone had to wait. That was the system. It was the only fair version of the system. The order in which a request was received was the only thing that determined when an inspector would arrive. The list was, in effect, the entire integrity of the Bureau. Anthony Saccavino, by the spring of 2021, controlled the list. Henry Santiago Jr. had retired from the FDNY in 2018 after 26 years on the job. He had finished his career as a senior firefighter in a Bronx ladder company and had left with his pension intact and his health more or less intact and no clear sense of what he was going to do next. He tried real estate. He tried a stake in a friend's bar in Throg's Neck. By 2020, with the city locked down and his savings shrinking, he started something else. He called it expediting. The idea was simple. Developers and owners who needed inspections faster than the Bureau could provide them would pay Santiago a fee. Santiago, in exchange, would make sure their projects were taken care of. He did not advertise. He did not file paperwork with the state. He operated out of a rented mailbox in a UPS store on East Tremont Avenue and a personal cell phone that he kept on a charger in the kitchen of his apartment. Word spread by referral, by handshake in a cigar lounge, by phone numbers passed across restaurant tables in Midtown. By the early months of 2021, Santiago was sending a list of names to Anthony Saccavino. The list grew over time. Project at an address in Long Island City. Project at an address in Sunnyside. Project at an address on the Upper West Side. A hotel renovation in Midtown. A school addition in Riverdale. An apartment building in Williamsburg. Saccavino, with the help of fellow Chief Brian Cordasco, used the authority of the Bureau to move those projects up the inspection queue. Inspectors were assigned. Plans were reviewed. Sign-offs were granted. The customers paid Santiago. Santiago paid Saccavino and Cordasco. The money came in cash, in envelopes, in amounts that were carefully sized to avoid the reporting thresholds that banks were required to flag. Saccavino received approximately $57,000 over the course of 2 years. Cordasco received a similar amount. Santiago kept the largest share, the cost of running the front. The total that flowed through the scheme was $190,000, across 30-plus projects, across 2 years. The expediting did not require the Bureau to skip safety procedures. It did not require an inspector to sign off on a building that should not have been signed off. What it required was the queue itself, the order of the list, to be quietly rearranged. A project that had been 48th in line moved to 4th. A request that had been filed in May appeared on an inspector's calendar in early June. A developer who had been waiting 8 months received a sign-off in 3 weeks. The customers who paid received an advantage that customers who did not pay could not receive at any price. Saccavino managed the cover at the Bureau itself. When subordinates asked why a particular project had been moved up, he had reasons ready. A safety concern that required immediate attention. A coordination request from a sister agency. A directive from above that he was not at liberty to explain. He used the authority of his rank to shut down the questions. Most subordinates accepted the explanations. A few did not. The ones who did not accept the explanations were the ones who began to talk to each other. The system held for 2 years. 2 years of envelopes. 2 years of phone calls. 2 years of projects moved up, while other projects, the ones owned by developers who did not know about Henry Santiago and would not have paid him if they did, sat on the list, waiting their turn, watching deadlines slip and carrying costs mount. Quick break before the floor falls out. If this case is making you angry, that is the right reaction. The Bureau of Fire Prevention exists because of every fire that ever killed people in a building that should have been inspected. Saccavino sold that office to whoever paid his middleman. Drop a comment letting me know what city you are watching from, because I promise you, the same kind of thing has happened in your own local building department at some point. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We do not let these stories quietly disappear. It began with a phone call. A developer in Brooklyn, working on a mid-rise condominium project on Atlantic Avenue, had been waiting on a bureau inspection for 9 months. His carrying costs were over $40,000 a month. He had heard, through a broker friend at a closing dinner in Tribeca, that there was a man named Henry who could help, and that Henry's fee was $25,000, and that Henry's results were reliable. The developer thought about it for 3 days. Then he called the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He did not call because he was a hero. He called because his lawyer told him that paying $25,000 to a retired firefighter for an unsanctioned service was the kind of payment that could end his career in development if it ever came out. And his lawyer's instinct was that it would, eventually, come out. The developer made the call in the spring of 2023. Federal investigators opened a file the following week. They walked the developer through a controlled approach. The developer met Santiago at a coffee shop on the Lower East Side. Santiago described the service. Santiago described the fee. Santiago, when pressed, named 2 FDNY chiefs by their first names. The conversation was recorded. The investigation widened that afternoon. For 6 months, federal agents worked the case quietly. They subpoenaed bank records. They tracked the cash withdrawals from the accounts of developers and owners whose names appeared on Santiago's referral lists. They cross-referenced those names against the Bureau's inspection scheduling records. They saw the pattern immediately. Projects belonging to Santiago's customers appeared on inspectors' calendars in defiance of the normal queue order. Projects belonging to non-customers sat where they had always sat. The mathematics of the pattern was unmistakable. By the autumn of 2023, the investigators had Santiago on tape multiple times. They had the bank records. They had the queue records. They had 3 of Saccavino's own subordinates ready to describe the moments when their chief had ordered an inspection moved up with an explanation that did not hold together when examined. What they did not have yet was Saccavino himself on tape. That came in November. The smoking gun was the list itself. The Bureau of Fire Prevention maintains, as a matter of routine practice, a master inspection scheduling document. It is updated daily. It records, for every active project in the city, the date a request was filed, the date a plan review was completed, the date an inspection was scheduled, the date an inspection was performed, and the date a sign-off was issued. The document is a living record of the order in which the city's buildings are being cleared for occupancy. It is the institutional memory of the Bureau. When federal investigators obtained the document under subpoena in the fall of 2023, they did not have to look hard. The projects whose owners had paid Henry Santiago appeared in the data as anomalies. They were filed in roughly the same window as their peer projects, but they were inspected weeks earlier than projects filed at the same time, weeks earlier than projects on the same block, weeks earlier, in some cases, than projects filed several months prior. The pattern was not subtle. It was a series of straight lines on a graph that should have shown a queue and instead showed a sorting mechanism that favored 30-plus specific projects in defiance of every protocol the Bureau had ever written. The bank records told the second half of the story. Saccavino did not keep his bribes in a bank account, but he could not keep them entirely off the books. Cash deposits in the months immediately following the queue manipulations. Cash purchases for items that had no corresponding withdrawal from a payroll account. A new piece of jewelry for Marisol. A weekend trip to a resort in the Poconos. A college tuition installment for his son. None of these things, in isolation, were criminal. Taken together, they showed a man whose lifestyle outpaced his stated income, even at a salary of $263,000 a year. The text messages between Saccavino and Cordasco were the third leg of the investigation, and the most damning. Brief, coded, but in the aggregate, undeniable. Cordasco, March 14, 2022. Brooklyn Atlantic Project. Hank says rush. Tuesday inspection. Saccavino, March 14, 2022. Done. Tell H to clear his end. Cordasco, May 6, 2022. Riverdale School. H has the envelope. Need this by month end. Saccavino, May 7, 2022. Moving it. Tell him we are at 4 for the quarter. 4 for the quarter. 4 bribes routed through Henry in 3 months with the chief's full knowledge and active participation. Federal prosecutors would later read those messages aloud at sentencing. The judge would shake his head visibly when the phrase 4 for the quarter was spoken in open court. By November 2023, federal agents had interviewed 9 of Saccavino's subordinates inside the Bureau. 6 of them described, in nearly identical language, conversations in which Saccavino had ordered a specific project moved up the inspection list with an explanation that did not hold together. One inspector recounted a conversation in which Saccavino had told him, when he asked why a particular midtown hotel renovation was being prioritized over a residential building with a pending alarm system issue, that the directive had come from people higher than you need to know about. The inspector described his own discomfort. He described pulling the file later and finding nothing in writing to support the prioritization. He described keeping a private log of every such instance from that day forward. By the time federal agents knocked on his door, his log ran to 17 entries. The case, by Thanksgiving of 2023, was finished. The grand jury voted to indict in the second week of December. Federal agents approached Anthony Saccavino at 7:14 in the morning on a Tuesday in February of 2024 in front of his Staten Island home. He had just stepped off his porch with his thermos. The black Ford Explorer was running at the curb. The agents came up the walk in two pairs. He saw them before they reached him. He stopped at the bottom step. Lead agent, Chief Saccavino, we are with the FBI. We need to ask you some questions about your work at the Bureau of Fire Prevention. He looked over his shoulder, briefly, at the closed front door. Saccavino, I don't know what you're talking about, but I have nothing to hide. Ask me anything. Lead agent, are you aware of an individual named Henry Santiago Jr.? A pause. 2 seconds. 3. Saccavino, Henry Santiago. Yes, he's a retired firefighter. I knew him on the job, years ago. Lead agent, when was the last time you spoke with Mr. Santiago? Saccavino, I would have to think about that. It's been months, maybe a year. The senior agent reached into a manila folder and held up a printed text message. The thread was from the previous week. Saccavino had texted Santiago about a sit-down at a diner in Sunnyside. He looked at the page. He looked at the agent. He did not answer for several seconds. Saccavino, I want to call my lawyer. Lead agent, that is your right, sir. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to solicit and receive a bribe. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. He turned around. He placed his hands behind his back. He looked at the closed front door of the house he had bought in 1995 and raised his 2 children in and shared a life with his wife in for nearly 30 years. He did not say another word. He was processed at the federal building in Lower Manhattan that morning, a few blocks from the site of the towers he had spent 8 months working in the aftermath of. He posted bond by the afternoon. He was placed on administrative leave by the FDNY by the end of the week. His bureau badge was returned to the deputy commissioner, who had written, the previous year, that Anthony Saccavino demonstrates integrity in administrative matters. The charges were filed in the Southern District of New York. Conspiracy to solicit and receive a bribe in connection with a program receiving federal funds. The maximum statutory penalty was 10 years. The federal sentencing guidelines, given the dollar amount of the bribes and the duration of the scheme, and Saccavino's role as the senior official involved, produced a recommended range of between 46 and 57 months. He pleaded guilty in early 2025. His attorney, a former federal prosecutor with offices in Midtown, did not contest the facts. The plea agreement acknowledged that Saccavino had solicited and received bribes through Henry Santiago. The plea agreement acknowledged that Saccavino had used his authority at the Bureau of Fire Prevention to move 30-plus projects up the inspection queue in exchange for payment. The plea agreement acknowledged that Saccavino had lied to his subordinates to cover the conduct. The plea agreement acknowledged that Saccavino had lied to federal agents when first questioned. Brian Cordasco pleaded separately. He received a sentence of 20 months. Henry Santiago, who had cooperated with investigators from the moment the controlled approach began, received a downward departure at his own sentencing. Santiago's testimony, in the end, had been the foundation of the case against the 2 chiefs. The sentencing hearing was held on May 14, 2025, before United States District Judge Louis J. Liman in Courtroom 15C of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse on Pearl Street. The hearing lasted just under 3 hours. 5 subordinates from the Bureau provided written statements that were entered into the record. 3 developers whose projects had been overlooked in favor of Santiago's customers gave statements describing the carrying costs they had absorbed while their projects sat on the list. A retired senior chief of the Bureau, who had trained Saccavino in the late 1990s, attended the hearing but was not asked to speak. The most striking statement came from a Bureau inspector named Dennis Halloran, who had worked under Saccavino for 6 years. Halloran, I am a public servant. I took an oath to ensure the safety of the buildings in this city. Every day I knocked on a door with a clipboard and a flashlight. I believed that the order in which I was knocking was the order the city had decided was fair. The chief took that fairness and sold it. He sold it to the developer who could afford his middleman. He sold it from behind a desk that the rest of us trusted. The thing I cannot forgive is that he made me, by accident, part of it. Judge Liman addressed Saccavino directly before pronouncing sentence. He spoke for nearly 9 minutes from prepared remarks. Judge Liman, Chief Saccavino, the bureau you led exists for one reason. It exists because, in the long history of this city, fires in buildings that should have been inspected have killed people. The system you ran in defiance of that history. You did not skip a single inspection, the government tells me. You did not approve a single dangerous building. I am sure that is true. But what you did do is sell the order. You sold the only thing the public was entitled to assume was not for sale. You sold it for $57,000 while you collected a city salary of $263,000. You sold it from the very office that exists so that the people of New York can walk into a building without wondering whether the inspection that cleared it was given a fair turn. I cannot, in conscience, treat that as anything less than a betrayal of public trust at the highest order. The sentence was 3 years in federal prison, a fine of $150,000, forfeiture of the $57,000 he had personally received in bribes, 3 years of supervised release upon completion of the custodial sentence. He was ordered to surrender to the Bureau of Prisons on July 15, 2025, at FCI Otisville in upstate New York, a low-security facility approximately 90 miles from his home in Staten Island. He surrendered on the date assigned. He was 40 days into his sentence when his wife visited for the first time. She told friends that she did not recognize the building, or the rules, or the man who walked across the visitation room in a khaki uniform with his name stenciled across the chest. He will be eligible for release in late 2027. He will be 64 years old. The pension he accrued in 40 years of FDNY service is reduced, but not entirely forfeited. The Bureau of Fire Prevention, in the months after his arrest, ordered a comprehensive audit of its scheduling practices. 38 specific projects were re-reviewed. 2 were ordered to undergo additional safety inspections. No structural deficiencies were identified. The expediting list itself, the document at the center of the case, has been retained as a permanent exhibit in the case file. It is the record of a public office that sold its order, project by project, envelope by envelope, for a sum that did not, in the end, justify what it cost the man who collected it. This case was infuriating, but the case on the right-hand side is even harder to stomach. Click it now.